Hello everyone, my name is Ali Mirzayan and currently I'm an assistant professor at Virginia State University. And in this presentation, we go over the adaptive gravity, which basically is a defense against adversarial examples. Here is the structure of this presentation. After investigating the problem statement and some of the attacks and defense challenges, we see the proposed method and some results. There are many of evidences that human brain can be fooled by optical illusions. Similarly, the neural networks are vulnerable to adversarial examples. For instance, here let's imagine a model has correctly classified the picture on the left as a stop sign. But by adding a small crafted perturbation, the same model classifies the picture on the right as a max speed 100, which obviously is wrong. Further, at this presentation, we see some ways to obtain this sort of perturbations and some ways to make it harder to find some such perturbations. Here is the chronological of some of the attacks and defenses. Attacks showed with the pink color and defenses are shown with the light green color. Everything started with Cezary paper 2013 that formally defined adversarial examples. And after that, different attacks and defenses are introduced. Here is a formal definition of adversarial example based on the Cezary paper. Let's imagine a model F correctly predicts the samples X, which comes from a distribution D. Now they're looking for a minimum perturbation R, in which by adding it to the input X, the result stays on the acceptable domain D, and the model F predicts it as the target label L. Then the adversarial example refers to X plus the obtained perturbation R. Here we see some of the examples of perturbation that lead to adversarial examples of X. However, they're looking for the minimum perturbation, which is showed at the picture on the bottom right. Goodfellow introduced the FGSM as the first order optimization algorithm for obtaining the perturbation. FGSM has two versions, targeted and non-targeted, which can be easily obtained. In the targeted version, the attacker not only wants a misclassification, but also wants the misclassification to be a certain label. However, in a non-targeted version, only a misclassification is sufficient. Gradient masking is one of the proposed defense methods. The intuition behind it is, what if the gradient are smooth and small, in which the attacker cannot use them for launching their attack? However, there are some attacks that they don't need to have a gradient to be launched. For example, at the figure bottom shows a method so-called knowledge distillation for training a second model that is defined by the attacker and he knows everything about it. It has been shown that the adversarial example have the transferability, meaning those adversarial examples on the second model with high probability can be also an adversarial perturbation for the original model that the attacker doesn't have access to its gradients. Adversarial training is another defense method in which tries to increase the generality of the trained model by updating the training data to include the adversarial examples obtained by different attacks. This process can be done iteratively in order to achieve an acceptable level. The more distinguished are the classes, the harder to find the adversarial examples. This is the main idea behind adaptive gravity. Let's consider a vulnerable model on the left which is marked by 0. The adversary applies some perturbation epsilon1 to the red square and causes the model classifies it as the blue circle. But in the resilient model, the classes are more separated from each other and each class is more concentrated. So at the resilient model, the adversary needs to apply perturbation epsilon2, which is much larger than the epsilon1, which means the added perturbation is more perceptible and accordingly more detectable. So how we get from stage 0 to stage 5 is what adaptive gravity is about. At the first step of adaptive gravity, the centroids for each one of the classes are obtained. As shown in the figure 1, there are 3 centroids corresponding to each classes. At the second step, we obtain the anti-gravity force regards to each one of the obtained centroid at the previous step. We see more detail about this in the next slide. From physics, we know that if two masses with m1 and m2 weights are located at the distance r from each other, the gravity force between them are obtained from the equation in the middle. And 2 facts can be obtained from this equation. First, the greater the distance between the masses are, the lower the gravity force is. And the second, the greater the masses are, the greater the gravity force between them are. For our paper, we define the mass of a class as the standard deviation of that class from its centroid, and the distance between each 2 classes defined as the Euclidean distance between their centroids. Now, the anti-gravity force for each centroid is obtained by summation of all the forces from other centroids. For example, 2 forces F12 and F13 are the forces from the centroid C2 and the C3 toward the centroid C1, respectively. So the anti-gravity force for the centroid C1 is obtained by the addition of F12 and F13. Unlike the gravity force that attracts masses toward each other, the anti-gravity force propels the centroids from each other. Now that the anti-gravity force for each one of the centroids obtained, at the third step, we move the centroids of each class to a new location in the direction of the anti-gravity force. How much each centroid moves is proportional to how large is the anti-gravity force. For example, at the figure 3, triangle class moves less than the square class because it has a smaller anti-gravity force. At the fourth step, the model is trained in order to lower the distance of each sample in a class from its corresponding centroid. By repeating these 4 steps, the process stops whenever the relocation of the centroid in step 3 is small, which ideally means that the classes are far apart from each other and also they are concentrated to their centroid. In this picture, we show the centroid movement of each one of the classes for 2 models that train on MNIST and CIFAR10 datasets. The red color represents the early iterations and the yellow color shows the later iterations. And the X and Y axis are the TSNE representation of the centroid in 2 dimensions. And as it shows, by going from iteration 0 toward iteration 50, the centroid moving apart from each other. But at the later iterations, this movement is small. In order to evaluate how good the classes are separating during different iterations, we use three metrics: ICD, ICC, and accuracy. ICD stands for intra-class divergence, which measure how far are classes from each other. The ICC stands for inter-class convergence, that measure how concentrated are the classes from their centroids. And the accuracy is the performance of the underlying model on the test dataset. On the left, figures that are related to MNIST dataset, accuracy start decreasing after iteration 10. However, on the right figure, which is related to CIFAR10 dataset, the accuracy is more stable. Now the question is, out of all of these 50 iterations, which iteration leading to the best model accuracy and resilience wise? For answering this question, we draw the figures on the second row that shows the relationship between ICC and ICD for each iteration. The square shapes represent the Pareto frontiers, and the circle ones show the ordinary iterations. So between all of the Pareto frontiers, we picked an iteration that leads to an accuracy higher than the predefined accuracy showed with that red line in the accuracy figure. Here we brought the performance of a model that has been trained on CIFAR10 dataset and the anti-gravity algorithm applied to it. For this experiment, we used 5 attacks: FGSM, BIM, MIM, PGD, and CNW. As it showed in the red rectangle, compared to the other defense mechanism, different versions of anti-gravity outperforms the other. For the model that trained on MNIST dataset and the anti-gravity applied to it has a better performance compared to the other methods, similar to the CIFAR10. And here is the performance of the model for black box attack on 2 dataset MNIST on top and CIFAR10 on bottom, which again, applying anti-gravity on a model increases the resilience of that model against black box attack. Thank you everyone for listening, and if you have any question or comment, please do not hesitate to reach out to us.